Conflict and violence have taken a toll on economic development in Africa. In this regard, Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia, Sudan, and Central African Republic experienced a very high level of deaths from political violence in 2014, accounting for over 75% of continent-wide political violence deaths in 2014. Certainly, many of the ongoing conflicts and related violence are subnational, but still capable of undermining cooperation, economic progress, and even regional integration. To discuss this, we have Ambassador Tom Amolo, High Commissioner of Kenya to Nigeria. Mr. Amolo served as High Commissioner of Kenya to South Africa before being posted to Nigeria. He has an extensive background in diplomacy and international relations, with previous assignments at the Kenya Mission at the United Nations in New York and Embassy of the Republic of Kenya in Washington, D.C., among other places. Please join me in my discussion with Ambassador Tom Amolo. Your Excellency, well, thank you very much for being in our Magoni studios. We're pleased to have you here. We want to talk about conflict and violence in Africa as far as how it affects development on the continent. And we're just wondering, do we have too much conflict in Africa today? And is it actually hurting development in Africa?
Well, I would, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me in your wonderful studios and your beautiful digs, and I want to appreciate your courtesy and your warm welcome. On the issue of whether we have too much conflict in Africa, I would rather argue that the conflicts that exist are being resolved by Africans. And if you look at the number from the early 80s to now, the number has dropped precipitously. When Kenya was in the Security Council in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Security Council's activities or focus, 40% of the Security Council's work was on Africa. We had Sierra Leone, we had Liberia, Rwanda. That has dropped precipitously in a nice way. In other words, Africa is changing. We're becoming increasingly comfortable with resolving our disputes through democratic means. And the conflicts that exist are not insoluble, including the ones which are closest to us, for example, in Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia. They're not intractable. There are problems, there are challenges which we in Africa can solve, and we're using the vehicles necessary to resolve them, which are the United Nations, whose job and duty is the maintenance of international peace and security. And then we have the African Union, whose job through the vehicle of the Peace and Security Committee, Council, so to speak, are able to deal with these challenges. And then you have African leaders themselves involved on a daily basis. We were in Central Africa the other day, President Uhuru Kenyatta, and something was brokered. South Sudan, Mali, even in Burundi, the challenges there are being managed and resolved by Africa. Let me put it another way. If you look at most of the conflicts today, they are not in Africa. They're in the rest of the world, Iraq, Iran, and so on and so forth.
Even the major kinds of conflict.
Well,
but we have many small types of
which many I can count only one or two in the continent of Africa. One or two. The challenges we have, in fact, are more to do with non-government related violence, terrorism in particular.
Yeah. Okay.
You see? Those are more the challenges.
I want to go back to your time, because I know that you spent some time in New York at the United Nations, and I imagine you were part of the people involved in the discourse that took place at that time.
Yeah.
And with your vast amount of experience in that connection, then wouldn't you say that although you think that that most of the conflict in the world are in other places like in Iran, Iraq. I mean, not
Iraq,
Syria,
yeah, exactly.
Some of these other places. But in Africa, don't we have a lot of internal conflict? Not necessarily violence, but conflict. Boko Haram in Nigeria, Mali, Central African Republic, Sudan, Burundi, Congo.
That's 5.
That's not a conflict.
That's 5. We have 50 countries
Somalia,
in the
the Al-Shabaab issue.
We have 50. Look, let's not look at the numbers. Let's look at where these conflicts began, how they're going, and what is being done to resolve them, and whether there is a template, whether there is a political will to address and resolve them. And the answer is yes. If you look at South Sudan, for example, well, South Sudan conflict is over. Now, inside Sudan itself now, the challenge is more of political will, and it's just a matter of time. If you look at Somalia, the challenges inside Somalia are also not they're not challenges that cannot be resolved. If you look at Central African Republic, internally we may see the ugly face of religion rearing its head against subnationalism, subnational ethnicity. Okay, you can see that, but then you also see not only the people in the country, but also external actors who are African getting involved and seeking to resolve them. That, for me, is a very positive thing. And if you look at, say, the problem of Boko Haram, it is not black and white. There are huge shades of gray. If you think about what Boko Haram represents, or what Al-Shabaab represents and is, there's a confluence of external, there's a confluence of internal, there is religion, there is politics, but in the heart of it, obviously, is politics. So if you address that, you begin removing the core of the challenge. And I believe now, as we go forward, inside Nigeria with Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab in the Eastern African sub-region, I believe if we withdraw or remove the core of the politics and the religion in particular, you begin to address the problem. So I'm very confident, I'm very, very confident that in the days and months to come, with new political dispensation, for example, in your country, Nigeria, you'll find the wherewithal to fight these challenges will be bigger, and there'll be more support, not only within Africa, but externally, with material and so on and so forth.
So the one thing that I find gratifying is that at least we don't see a lot of conflict. We don't see a lot of interstate conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that
much of what we have is more intra-state.
Exactly. And you see, that is a huge difference.
But that also means something. And I was going to come to that to say, is there some origin to that? Could we trace it back to, say, to colonialism? To the days when our so-called colonial masters came and they had this principle or policy of differentiation and exclusion. And it was up, we're here at the top, and these people that we are ruling at the bottom. And when they exited, because we gained independence, then the ruling tribes, could we say that they then also tried to practice that same principle?
You have a good
that
point.
The colonial masters were
I
practicing,
would not,
and that's probably why we have some of the internal strife that we have today.
I would not dispute that. I would actually say that it is a natural situation that when power moves, the vacuum created is filled by another player. And in most of our African countries, when power moved out with the exit of the British or the French or the Germans or the Portuguese, the most dominant ethnic community that had maybe gone to school more or had economic power moved quicker to take up the offices, the positions of power in that country. But I would not say that it's only because of colonialism. I mean, if you look at all our societies, pre-colonial society, and we abhorred vacuum. There'd be hunting raids, there'd be exploration, there'd be raids to other parts of the country. You'd have people moving from one place, conquering another, Uthman Dan Fodio, you'd have the people of Benin Kingdom moving and wars and so on and so forth. In other words, it has changed appreciably because of what colonialism meant. Colonialism, what it brought was now a different mode with new economic instruments of managing power. In the old days, it was gold and maybe cattle where you managed your power. Now you have instruments of power such as guns, weapons. You have dollars, and you have subtle economic instruments that you can use to enhance your power. So I would argue that, although that is there, I would argue that indeed that was inevitable. And what we need to be looking at is how do we manage these contradictions that have emerged in our societies from the time of colonialism. Most of us have been able to just let it pass. But as the years have moved on, it is becoming increasingly impossible to let these contradictions simmer unattended because they'll erupt. And that is why it's always good, like in Kenya, to think about how to manage a society. And the way to do so is to evolve a good constitution, a constitution that addresses the challenges of the poorest and the weakest. That is why we've moved from a unitary constitution, a unitary government, to one which has devolved units. It's not necessarily federal. And that's why Nigeria moved from just a unitary government to a federal government to begin addressing the challenges of the contradictions that exist.
So let's look at Kenya just a little bit, since you brought it up. Perhaps it is not as extremely peaceful as, say, Tanzania, but it is one of the most peaceful countries on the continent. But every now and then, during election times, we've seen reports of conflict. That kind of conflict, what's been the origin of it? Is it tribal? Is it just political?
Power. And let me correct you.
What is it? Yes.
Let me correct you. Kenya is very peaceful. I come from Kenya, and as you can see, I'm a very peaceful man. But more importantly, when you say peace, I think you're speaking to the challenges brought by external factors such as Boko Haram. Internally, during elections, the unfortunate reality is some political actors cannot accept that they've lost. And that's why you find inevitably in all political contests that there will be some violence. However, the last election was very different.
It was peaceful, yes.
It was completely peaceful. Yes. In fact, I served in South Africa as well. And I recall one of the elections, I went, and one of the striking things for me then was there was no violence first. Nobody died. But their history is different. Our history is different. We are evolving. The previous election from the one in 2013, many people died.
Yes.
But this election, there was none. So we have a positive trend line. And I argue that positive trend line is everywhere.
So I think that you said it right even at the beginning. We say Africa is rising. And I was happy when you said that we've seen a sharp decline in the level of conflict and violence in Africa from the 80s to today, which is true. And then that's also coincided with the period when Africa is said to be rising. Having come out of the so-called 2 lost decades of the 80s and 90s. The Africa rising, which to me means stronger economic growth, is that coincident, or is it as a result of decline in violence, in conflict?